Good afternoon to everyone. We are about to make a start. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I want to thank all of you for attending, but my specific thanks goes to the panelists who very kindly agreed to share their time with us this afternoon in exploring different aspects of the legacy of the artist Robert Jim McLeod, whose work has been on display on and off through hurricane, storm, and volcanic ash, and a few other things, for the last several months since February 2nd. So I'm very happy to welcome the speakers for this afternoon, including Mr. Mcleod Wilshire, a genealogist and family historian, who regrettably couldn't be here but sent his wonderful recording, The Hunt for Robert McLeod, to allow us to understand a bit more of the personality behind the paintings. Following him is Dr. Lennox Honeychurch, eminent historian and raconteur on the landscapes. He speaks on the title Lost Horizons, Recovering the Landscape Heritage of McLeod's Caribbean. So he's talking about the place. And he will be followed by Winston Kelman, the artist and tutor, who will be talking about landscape as legacy, a contemporary perspective, bringing into focus the process behind the work of Robert McLeod. We want to recognize that McLeod, when we embarked on the research, I think this panel is more about finding Robert McLeod than it is about McLeod's work itself, except for Winston's part. But when we embarked on the research necessary for the development of a retrospective exhibition of this artist, we began as normal by searching our own records here at the museum, any exhibition catalogs and texts in certain journals and magazines. And I can safely say that while we did find what we were expecting amongst his exhibition lists on file, newspaper clippings, and articles, evidence of McLeod's activities, what we had not expected was to find such a long-standing and almost intimate relationship between the Barbados Museum and the artist, lasting almost 3 decades. Robert James McLeod's January 1951 exhibition at the Barbados Museum and Historical Society was a critically important signal for a number of reasons. A year earlier, in the Barbados Advocate, was published an opinion piece which responded to the trenchant criticism of the British Council. It was signed simply a Barbadian. The author was forthright in his assessment as to the state of Barbadian art at the time. He says, we should be grateful to the British Council for filling the gaps so long left open. Your correspondent does not think that the West Indies are without art or beauty. If by beauty he means beauty of nature, I agree with him. But where is the art? I'm unaware of the existence of an art gallery, meaning National Art Gallery, in any of the West Indian colonies. In Barbados, the interiors of homes do not display much sign of taste or beauty. The pictures of even well-to-do Barbadians are usually poor reproductions, prints, or watercolors. No local artist could make a living by selling his work to fellow Barbadians, and the attendance at art exhibitions is depressing. The op-ed signaled a beacon of change in the post-war colony. The post-war establishment of the Barbados Arts and Crafts Society, led by artists Golda White, Carl Hagen, Briggs Clark, and others in 1944, which sought to meet the growing need for the development of arts in the community. McLeod, like many other artists, enthusiastically supported the BACS exhibition and fundraising events. Yet even after 7 years of voluntary activity by that society, there were still major deficiencies in the visual art resources of the colony. Operating out of Queen's Park House with the support of the St. Michael's Vestry, this served as the island's most important art venue until the end of 1950. The author of the same op-ed piece spoke to an understanding of the need for a space which supported the visual arts community's needs for professional practice and to advocate for art education to develop serious audiences and to drive the development of the local art market. From the 1940s, McLeod was an active contributor to the development of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. In March 1943, the Museum's Council appointed him to the post of honorary curator, stating that they had no hesitation in appointing Mr. McLeod as he was well known, and I quote, well known for his excellent paintings of Barbadian scenery and as a teacher of art, and added later that they felt that, quote, their highest expectation of his occupancy of the office had been achieved. He produced backgrounds for the museum's natural history displays, produced a series of images, some of which you're just now seeing, of the colonial military prison which housed the museum. By 1945, however, Mr. McLeod's valuable services came to an end, and the council, while acknowledging their appreciation of his work during the 2 years that he had held office, noted that they regretted that the cause of his enforced retirement had plagued his poor health and eyesight for most of his life. Following the amalgamation of the Barbados Arts and Crafts Society with the BMHS at the beginning of 1951, the opening of a new gallery was established under the stimulus of the new director, Mr. Neville Connell. The new gallery space gained immediate recognition as evidenced in another editorial of the Barbados Advocate as part of, and I quote, a heroic effort to spread, quote, culture and education to the community through the extension of the new gallery or the recognition of the new gallery, the only one on demand to meet the expanding potential of the museum. The museum's president, Sir John Saint, saw the occasion of the opening of this gallery as, quote, marking the second stage of the museum's progress. Remember, the museum had only been open from 1933, so it's just in a 15-year period. And he signaled that this museum will have become of more and more importance to the island and of its development. In his opening speech, Governor Sir Alfred Savage pronounced that he considered it of the greatest value that there should be an institution of this kind in Barbados, and went on to state, it is good to see the further development of the museum in this new gallery. I'm glad that it has become possible to reconstruct the old cells of the military prison in developing this museum and to produce such an attractive gallery. Within 6 months of its opening, the museum was overrun with requests to book the space, and McLeod was amongst the first. In a review of McLeod's 1951 exhibition, the critic acknowledged changes in the artist's production as a result of, quote, a subtle maturing, which is of interest to those of us who have followed his work over the years. In reviewing the 32 pieces that hung in the newly constructed space, he complimented the artist on producing a masterful distillation of his subject, and that the sky and sea were alive, and the handling of them is most convincing, as indeed it is in all his seascapes. However, another reviewer also pointed to the importance of their setting. The gallery in which these paintings are being shown is without equal for such exhibitions, since it has been specially constructed for such a purpose. The pictures are being shown as they would be in any big city and to their best advantage. So exhibiting in this new museum gallery became a prime opportunity for MacLeod, along with many other local and foreign artists, thus achieving the imprimatur of the then sole national art institution in the country. It was the beginning of a long-term relationship where the artist exhibited his works every winter season for 3 to 4 weeks in January or February of each year in that space. And as McLeod reported in later years, he devoted all of his time to painting the West Indian scene, which holds for him an unlimited attraction. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, McLeod also regularly participated in many group and contemporary art shows curated by the museum's director and curator, Neville Connell. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is a bit of the context in which McLeod began to show his work at the museum, but it also demonstrates how the museum was growing up with him at the same time. So without any further ado, might I ask you, Elena, could you put on Robert Murcutt Wilshire's his bio, and could we hear his presentation? Unfortunately, Murcutt Wilshire could not be with us this afternoon, but he very kindly made himself available through a recorded message, which we will now hear.
Hello, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Murcutt Wilshire. I was born in Barbados and attended Harrison College, then St. Mary's College in Trinidad, the University of the West Indies at Mona, and Queen's University in Canada. Though I had done A-level history, my university studies were all in language and literature, a far cry from history. It was only when I began to research the origins of my own Barbadian family that I realized how important it was to learn all I could about West Indian history so as to better understand the origins of the people who colonized the British West Indies and Barbados in particular. This all led to a rather mad attempt to reconstruct the earliest settler families in Barbados, to trace their descendants, and in turn to try and uncover the histories of the enslaved Africans whose descendants now comprise the majority of the island's populations, as well as of the free coloreds who have been described by Professor Jerome Handler as the unappropriated people. Fortunately, the start of my genealogical studies coincided with the early development of personal computers and genealogical software, which made possible what had never before been attempted, the creation of a digital record of Barbadians and other West Indians and their families using original vital records, and especially abstracts of the earliest Barbados wills that often reveal how individuals and families are interconnected. And some of you, I'm sure, may have used the wonderful Sanders will abstracts. The initial digital record morphed into an enormous database covering hundreds of thousands of individuals, which has enabled me over the years to assist many people around the world who were researching their Barbadian origins, as well as a number of academics and scholarly authors seeking information on people of West Indian origin. I hope eventually to lodge the database with the Barbados Museum Library as an aid to others in their family research. So when Barbados Museum Director Alessandra Cummins approached me to help her find information on an artist, Robert James McLeod, I'm ashamed to admit that I had never heard of him. All she could tell me was that he was born in 1888 in New York, of a Scottish father and a Barbadian mother. There was also some confusion over his identity, as he appeared to have been conflated with another artist also named Robert McLeod, but born in Canada. The hope was that I might be able to determine just who the real Barbadian Robert McLeod was. Luckily, I just happened to have Robert's mother, Ida Elizabeth Yearwood, and her family in my database, since I myself have Yearwood ancestry and had done very detailed research on the Yarwoods, to use the more usual Bajan pronunciation. Ida was born in 1862 in Roebuck Street, Bridgetown, the daughter of St. Michael planter William Jones Yearwood and his wife Mary Ney Jones, the daughter of a Speightstown merchant. But I knew nothing of Ida's marriage. The search therefore had to begin in New York, where Robert was born. I began by consulting Ancestry.com to hunt for Ida's marriage, and hence the identity of her MacLeod husband, as well as the birth record of her son. Since New York records are usually excellent, I was quite surprised that I could find nothing, so I turned to the US and state census records. Unfortunately, all the 1890 US Census records were lost, I believe, in a fire, but my first eureka moment was in finding an entry in the 1895 New Jersey State Census for Ida MacLeod, living in Jersey City, Hudson County, New Jersey, with son Robert J. McLeod, daughter Esther C. McLeod, and her mother Mary Yearwood. There was no mention of a Mr. McLeod, so they appeared to have been separated sometime after the birth of their daughter Esther, for whom I could find no birth record. But I did find Esther's death record just 3 years later, on the 1st of May 1898, in New Jersey, aged 6, so born in 1892. I then found that Ida had remarried in 1900. She appears as Ida E. Kaiser in the 1900 census at 240 Jackson Avenue, Jersey City in Hudson, New Jersey, with her new husband, William F. Kaiser, born in New York, and son Robert J. McLeod, but not her mother Mary Yearwood. It turned out that Mary had actually remarried in 1899 in New Jersey to a George Quick, and that would prove to be very significant. Since Ida must have been widowed or divorced before her remarriage, I went back to hunting for her elusive husband, seeking any death of a Scot named MacLeod any time between 1892 and 1900. Only one such person appeared in all the New York death records, a John Sutherland MacLeod, born in Scotland in 1855 and who died in New York in 1899, the year before Ida's remarriage. Since I've never found any marriage record for Ida, I cannot definitively prove that this was Ida's husband, but based on the probabilities, he is the most likely candidate. Moreover, in his death record, his father's name is given as Robert McLeod, the name of his son. Ida had 3 daughters with her new husband, all born between 1900 and 1904, but sadly she died in New Jersey in September of 1904. And though Mary Quick and Robert both appear in the 1900 census, neither appears anywhere in 1905 state census records. I had been told that Robert had spent much of his childhood in Barbados, and it therefore occurred to me that Mary must have taken Robert back to Barbados after Ida's death in 1904. And sure enough, the two of them traveled together from Barbados to New York in 1906 and again in 1909. Robert then travels by himself to New York in 1912 and again in 1914. Grandmother and son then both return permanently to New York from Barbados in 1917. In the US Census of 1920 and the New York Census of 1925, Robert, described as an artist, is living in Brooklyn with his grandmother Mary Quick. But the most significant record is Robert's 1918 World War I draft record. He is living with his grandmother and is an art student at Parsons School, 80th Street and Broadway in New York City. Parsons, of course, being the most prestigious art academy of New York. Mary Quick died early in 1930 before the census, so neither she nor Robert are recorded in the census of that year, and he never again appears in US Census records. However, he's a frequent voyager, arriving in New York from Bermuda in 1930 and from Barbados in 1931. In 1934, he travels to and from England and is described in the manifest as a commercial artist. The idea that the Barbadian artist Robert McLeod was the same person as another artist with the same name may have originated in an error in the 1920 US Census, in which Robert's birthplace is recorded as Canada. However, the record is clear. His father's birthplace is Scotland, his mother's Barbados, spelled Barbados, and he's living with his then divorced grandmother, Mary Quick, also born in Barbados. Interestingly, Robert's occupation is given as a clerk in a publishing house. Alessandra tells me that there did turn out to be a second artist named Robert McLeod, but his signature on a painting proved him to be a totally different individual, and I believe that she will expand further on that. Perhaps at some time in the future, other records may be found that would provide definitive proof of the identity of Robert's father, but I have learned over the course of more than 30 years of genealogical research that there are some puzzles which may never be solved. For now, I am confident that what we have found is as close to the truth as we are ever likely to get. I would just like to conclude by thanking Alessandra for having roped me into what turned out to be a truly intriguing quest. Thank you for listening.
I want to place on record our deep gratitude to Ernest Murcott Wilshire, because without him as a professional genealogist, we would never have been able to unravel this complex mix of family names and individuals, and indeed our Robert sharing the same space of one and even two Robert McLeods. So we are very, very grateful for that presentation. I'm just sorry you couldn't be with us, but I think we've all benefited from that presentation, and to learn what it takes really to truly understand the person who has produced the paintings. So now, without any further ado, I'd like now to turn to our colleague Lennox Honeychurch, who, again, deep gratitude to you, Lennox, because again, without you, we wouldn't have known what it was we were looking at. There were so many paintings, so many images of these landscapes, but we could not tell where they were and whether they were Barbados. With your help, you've understood that Robert really was a Caribbean artist. So Lennox, over to you on your presentation. And I really want to thank you for being willing to give up this afternoon to help us.
Well, that's a great pleasure, Alessandra, certainly to be involved with the work of this artist who I first came across in my teenage years when my family would regularly stay at the Ocean View. And I remember those paintings in the public rooms of the Ocean View, and being as a young hopeful painter myself, being very much attracted to them. And the variety, of course, of his work, that combination, which is extremely interesting in his work, of Barbados, the flatter island covered in mainly in his paintings in crisscross fields of sugarcane, in contrast to the Windward Islands, and mainly it seemed Dominica and St. Lucia, but some others fitted in as well. Perhaps we have some of St. Vincent, but certainly the most obvious islands are St. Lucia and also Dominica. And then after Alessandra asked me to get on board, I then found out from my own family that during the 1940s, Robert McLeod would rent our plantation house, my grandmother's house really, up a deep mountainous valley off the west coast of Dominica called Antrim Valley. And the old plantation house basically was locked up most of the time. It was put out for rent. There are actually advertisements in the Bajan magazine with pictures of the house, inviting Bajans, I assume, that was its readership, to rent this place in Dominica. And sure enough, it appears that for a brief period, and maybe more than once, Robert McLeod rented this place. And certainly it is reflected in his art, because one of the paintings which were on display here was of the center of the island, looking across the center of the island from an area called Sylvania, an orange plantation in the 1940s and early 50s called Sylvania. And then other views looking along the west coast of Dominica with the mountains plunging into the Caribbean Sea. The wonderful thing that attracts me about his art is the reflection of color, the way in which he uses a sort of post-impressionist style, if you will, although it does have a touch of realism to it, particularly that reflection of light, the clouds and the sea, and his amazing use of green and the variety of greens. And it was Alec Waugh, that famous British author of Island in the Sun, for instance, and many other travel books and novels, who talks about visiting Dominica and being almost dazzled by the various contrasts of green. He has a wonderful passage in his book, The Sugar Islands, where he talks about this variety of greens. And he said somewhere that it was strange that green was a color that sometimes could dazzle you. And that comes through very strongly in McLeod's work, particularly when he is painting in the volcanic Windward Islands. And this contrast is extremely interesting, but his use of and his interpretation of sunlight is the same, regardless of whether he's dealing with green-covered mountains or with the coral cliffs, which he did so well, or the seas, particularly the ones that we notice along the east and north coast of Barbados. And then there's this other aspect, and it's very important to us from an historical point of view. That is his work done reflecting particularly the harbors, the towns of those two islands, mainly the Windwards, and of course, the very attractive paintings that he has done of the Careenage. There are these paintings like this one right here before us, which I believe may actually be up in New York or somewhere.
Yeah, Brooklyn.
Yeah, that's right, because you don't get any schooners in it. And what we must remember is by relating his paintings to the period of time, the historic period in the Caribbean, that is mainly the 40s and into the early 50s, the fact is that schooners dominated. During the Second World War, the motorized steamships that were connecting the Caribbean before in the 1930s, such as like the Lady Boats, Lady Nelson, Lady Drake, that everybody used to connect each other up and down between the eastern seaboard of the United States, but also as far as Halifax in Canada. Those were the main vessels that were used for visitors coming through during peacetime. Some of them were blown up by German U-boats, but generally motorized shipping, and particularly those coming from distances like Europe and the North America were totally wiped off the map. And so for that period, in the 40s and until the steamship companies got back on their feet in the 50s, the Caribbean, or islands of the Eastern Caribbean, were basically kept together by schooners. And Barbados was the center of the schooner pool during the war, where these schooners would be there in the careenage, designated with numbers that then was selected to take supplies to the other islands. And there was an office, the schooner pool. And my aunt, who's still alive, Ellis Cullimore, she was a secretary, and she also held the codes, the important codes for the movement of schooners and other shipping, to know where they were moving up and down the islands. And so you get this impression, this impact from his work, that the importance of schooners. And if you tie it into the late 1940s and you link it in with the early poems of Derek Walcott, those paintings match the poetry so well. Walcott is talking so much about schooners and schooner captains and sailors and the ports and the harbors. And then, of course, the mountains of his island, St. Lucia, and the pitons, which feature in Robert McLeod's work. And particularly, a couple of his paintings that feature the waterfront of Castries. Now, there was this major fire, very disastrous fire in 1948. Walcott wrote a poem about it, but McLeod is there before the fire, and we see the waterfront and the houses in Castries depicted by him. So there again, you get this fantastic historical record of what Castries was like prior to the fire, and of course it changed in the rebuilding. And therefore, McLeod can be linked to that. You've got Walcott's poems, and you've got McLeod's paintings, and you've got the events taking place in the 1940s and the effects of that. And even in Barbados, in pictures like the one that we're seeing here of Bissex Ridge and Hill over in St. Joseph, maybe bordering parts of the painting into St. Andrew, what actually we're seeing is his use of another type of landscape, but within Barbados itself. And here we have the painting from Sylvania Plantation, looking across the interior of Dominica, which is much the same then as it is today. And this was just a little up from where he used to rent at Antrim. You would go up the road and you would get these scenes with the royal palms depicting places where habitation was, and looking across the mountains. And you can see here his use of green. Now, there were two painters in Dominica at the time that he, Robert McLeod, was very aware of and linked with, and this was Stephen Hoyes and Percy Agar. And both of them in the early 1950s had exhibitions at the Barbados Museum. And in fact, the Barbados Museum, and it moves from time to time, but generally at its entrance going up to the museum library, there's this wonderful painting by Stephen Hoyes of Heliconias. Stephen Hoyes was mainly a painter of nature, and particularly flowers and fish and that sort of stuff. And what we find is that, particularly in the case of Percy Agar and his early 1950s exhibition, and the use of the Barbados Museum as this place for these exhibitions, is that these artists would come to Barbados, particularly, as has already been mentioned by Alessandra, during that period of January, February, when the tourists were visiting. And they would sell their paintings through the museum. So there's a link there with McLeod's work as well. And besides the schooners, which I mentioned earlier, there are the fishing boats, because when we see the scenes of St. Lucia, for instance, he not only does Castries, but he has these wonderful paintings of the shoreline at Soufriere with the pitons rising sharply around it. And in it, you see the the square sails, they're particularly associated with the dugout canoe, which is a feature of places like Martinique, St. Lucia, and Dominica. And these fishing boats feature very heavily in MacLeod's work in the Windward Islands. And these dugout canoes, of course, date back to pre-Columbian times. So you've got this sort of representation of the islands before the big change into mass tourism, into air transportation, into cruise shipping arrivals. It's really anchored the Eastern Caribbean, and particularly those three islands of Barbados, Dominica, and St. Lucia. It's anchored them in time. And whenever he does choose to put people within it, you get that atmosphere of the time, the sort of casual drift, the lack of hurry and rush. Those last years before political change as well, you know, universal adult suffrage in 1951, the more intense political activity of the 50s and the 60s. But interestingly enough, I just wanted to show, if you click back on me and my vision, that in the Independence magazine of 1966, the Barbados Independence magazine, I don't know if you can see it, if the controller of the presentation can click on me, but certainly within the Barbados and Independent Nation magazine, which basically covers Barbados, we get, here we are. This is the Independence magazine of 1966. And in it, it's covering all aspects of Barbados, introducing Barbados as an independent nation, and has a very interesting section on the arts in Barbados. And it features actually a painting of Robert McLeod at his easel up there at the top in what to me is the top right-hand corner. And there he is being presented on independence as a Barbadian artist, but interestingly enough, it adds a sort of generational note. They talk, for instance, about people like Carl Broodhagen, etc. And then they go on to say the works of Robert McLeod and Harold Connell, artists of the older generation, are very well known. And then he goes on to Hector Whistler, a Barbados resident, is a renowned professional painter of world art, and all of these other things. But certainly here, the works of Robert McLeod and Harold Connell, artists of the older generation. And this is in 1966, when the island is celebrating its independence. So he's very much associated with the development of national art. And also on the same page, we have the younger artists like Grantley W. Prescott and Ivan Payne. They are featured, and Briggs Clark. They're all on the same page together, which is really a nice representation of MacLeod as inclusive part of the Barbadian experience. And so I notice that my 15 minutes is up, and I hope that I have given an overview and a taste of the paintings from a historical perspective, a geographical perspective, and part of a reflection of the Caribbean at a particular point in time. Thank you very much. And thanks, Alessandra, for inviting me and bringing me on board.
Lennox, that was magnificent. Thank you so much. You put so much more into the story than I thought was possible in 15 minutes, but I knew you knew your subject, and then you've gone and added a wealth of other information and observations on top. Thank you so much for that presentation. And I think now that people will have had a sense of where Robert McLeod fit in you know, in the local landscape, in the Caribbean setting, and how he was viewed by his peers within this presentation. Yes, Alison, I agree with you. It was 15 minutes too short. Another time we will talk. But but one of the key things that you have done for us is, again, associated him with his Caribbean counterparts, both in poetry and in the art. And I thank you very much for that presentation. I did not introduce you properly, but everybody has your bio, and you know, frankly speaking, I could go on and on forever in terms of your contribution. But I'd now like to turn to our other colleague, Winston Kelman. Winston, you again are going to be, I know, a wonderful speaker. And we're turning to you now to have an understanding of the artist's practice, you know, literally, how is he seeing what he's seeing? So you're talking about landscape as legacy from a contemporary standpoint, and I look forward to hearing your findings. So over to you, Winston Kelman.
Thanks, Alison, for inviting me. And it's really an opportunity for me to look at the work of a landscape painter in particular, because landscape as a genre has had very little, almost critical evaluation generally, and even less in the Caribbean, considering, you know, the long history of representation that we've had here. There hasn't been much on it. Maybe there weren't that many artists like MacLeod whose work could command, you know, such a retrospective in the landscape genre. So maybe it was lack of opportunity from the point of view of artists as well, as, you know, because sometimes critics find artists, but, you know, artists sometimes practice without being found by the critics. But anyway, we've got him, and it's a nice retrospective. I want to really reflect on some of the ideas coming out of how his practice was framed based on the catalog, the sections within the catalog. Of course, I'm going to be speaking from the point of view of a practicing painter and a landscape painter as well. And the territory that he inhabits, or he inhabited, is very similar territory to the ones that I have concentrated on since back to the Caribbean 30 years ago. And like him, the island became the subject of most of the work. And some, I'll go through the categories that I've listed to give some idea of what I'm talking about. The first is about place, the idea that the art is centered around places, and it's about somewhere. And that pleases me a lot, particularly in the Caribbean, where the place is of paramount importance to the creative activity. And so it's culturally specific. Some may see that as a limitation, but I see that as a basis for expansion. You know, people tend to forget that Mont Saint-Victoire was in France, and that Arles was also in France, and, you know, Guernica was in Spain. So those international artists have always, to my mind, painters in particular, been very local. And one of the criticisms that we always seem to get about Caribbean artists is that it is too local, you know, and we should go beyond the island. But what I like about this work is that it is about the island, and as Honeychurch was saying, specific period of time in the island. So it's a kind of historical document. It is also realist in the sense that you can identify the subject in a real way. I mean, he said touches of impressionism there, but there was never any need to go into abstraction, because he wants to be very specific about the islands. And abstraction, sometimes you lose the subject into abstraction. And that's why I think realism and figuration in particular is not a bad thing in terms of analysis of a place. So that's the first category, place. Realism as opposed to abstraction, and then the notion of the fact that it's historically relevant. It shows a period in time in a particular place. And I think that's always useful, because not only is it aesthetically pleasing, but it's also educational. And it's a kind of, well, the second category that I've got is the picturesque and preserving paradise. I think that's why it's listed in the catalog. There are two terms again that require some kind of explanation. The picturesque, as we know, came out of the 19th century idea, a colonial idea of places that were being described by the landowners and, you know, the plantation owners. And so it really reflected a view of the person who commanded, who owned the landscape. And the idea of paradise, I've twinned that with that, with the picturesque, again, is suggesting that it is somewhere that is enjoyed by others. Because the notion of paradise, well, maybe we can talk about this later on, but isn't necessarily an insider's position. It is usually seen as a view from outside. I mean, it becomes even more interesting to my mind when paradise is really your reality and not someone else's fantasy, which I think we in the Caribbean have to work with, you know, as artists, because although the scenery is seen as a sort of tropical paradise, it is really our normal habitation. So it is what you do with it that makes it important. But it's just something that is worthy of being discussed. How do we conceptualize the picturesque as Caribbean artists? And how do we conceptualize the notion of paradise? So that was the second idea for reflection. Third idea is, again, the section action and adventure. This is the part that really appeals to me as a painter, particularly a landscape painter, and particularly a painter of the Barbadian landscape. And I will show you later on, again, I've done again the same four ideas. I've got 4 images of some very specific landscapes that he has done and that I have done as well. Not quite sure about similar content, but that again can be expanded on. Action, adventure, emotion. And I've chosen the Cruel Sea. I think this is the one that's on the screen now. The Cruel Sea. Why do I think this is important? Because he's given the landscape a kind of it becomes a person capable of emotion. It has an emotional force to it. It's not just descriptive, but it's descriptive of something. The Cruel Sea, even the title suggests something which may not necessarily be the idea of paradise. It's the inverse actually of paradise. It's dangerous. But again, the notion of paradise can carry both of those things as well, which I think he does, you know, and it's an area of interest that I have, where something that is ostensibly very beautiful is also very dangerous. I think you might have mentioned in the catalog and the duality with the prisons, but I think the duality for me exists with the threatening landscape and the beauty of the landscape simultaneously. And then the fourth category, which is to do with identity. Again, we talked about his identity and how slippery that can be. You know, first he was American, then he was Canadian, and then he realized that after all, he was actually Barbadian. And maybe that is again an area of interest, which is fascinating too, because again in the catalog, it's the identity of the free colored that has been described. And I want to talk a little bit about that too, because of the description, who is describing the free colored and how are they conceptualized? And again, it's the position of the artist as well, you know, who is doing the description. But I want to extend that, if I can, also later on, to the artist as the identity of the artist as being equally significant in the production of the work, as well as the people or the person described. So it'll be three types of identities that I could look at: the identity of the artist, the identity of the figure in the landscape, and then the identity of the work, where it's located. So those are my four areas of reflection, which I hope can be developed, and I also just wanted to, if I could, show you the four landscapes that were present in his work, that are also present in my work as well. The first one, this is the Cotton Tower, and these two, his is of the Cotton Tower with the freed colored lady walking in the foreground. Mine is of the Cotton Tower, if you can go back to that one, consumed by the landscape, dwarfed, in fact. His was very prominent and very dominant, and I think he was talking about the control, the colonial control. We know the history of the signal stations, etc. But mine, as a contemporary kind of interpretation, shows it almost forgotten, engulfed by the landscape, but still present in the landscape, a presence that's still maybe not seen so dominantly, but is still felt. The second one would be the picturesque, and I think I had, if you go to the next set, which would be the picturesque, that's his of the Atlantic coast with its dangerous waves and tides, and that one is also of Martin's Bay. Again, very specific landscapes. And if you continue on, again, Martin's Bay, again, he's very specific about where the work is. And there were the ones I had of my, right, this is one of the Atlantic coast, Bashiba, with the, again, threatening waves. There was another one, that one as well. I mean, where it's not just beautiful, something else is trying to be suggested. It's actually a very difficult thing to try to achieve as a painter, to get the kind of emotion in the landscape. And again, it relies on your approach to its depiction. And this is the kind of frenzied emotional approach, which hopefully tries to suggest something other than just the thing depicted. And the other one, this one again, it's to do with atmosphere. The same beautiful tropical scene, but again, the atmosphere that is conveyed is, should we say, not just pleasure and relaxation. What other images do I have? Right, the landscape. Again, there are a lot of coconut trees, which again suggests it's just a subject area. And this is how I've chosen to work with the idea of tropical vegetation, to show its complexity rather than its simplicity. But it's a similar territory. And then the last one, I think that was the last one. There was another one with, again, a house in sort of vegetation, but it was just looking at landscape and how landscape can conjure up different states of emotion rather than just the thing depicted. It attempts something a little, well, a more emotional, intuitive approach to it rather than just a description. So those are my areas of reflection, and all coming out of the work that we've seen.
Again, thank you so much, Winston. That was great. I hope that I think you've provided a lot of food for thought, a greater understanding of the artist's process and the visual, the impact of the visual. So thank you very much for helping us look in depth at some aspects of MacLeod's work. Really very much appreciated. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to give time to you. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to post them in the chat or raise your hand if you want. But I do want to give space and time to a couple of questions or comments to our speakers while we have them. And then before we wrap up in about 15-20 minutes time. So are there any questions or comments from the audience, as it were? I can say a little bit more then about Robert McLeod, the other Robert McLeod, because I was very tempted to call this whole presentation, will the right Robert McLeod stand up? Because had it not been for the work of a number of people, and I want to, at this point, pay special tribute to the Goddard family and to Simon Crindler and his parents, Rain Chandler's family, and John Chandler, who knew MacLeod, knew his friends, knew his work, and helped protect, helped protect that memory of that personage that was tremendously important. But as you heard from Mcleod Wilshire, I did have, once I had a picture in mind of where MacLeod came from, we were able to be more conclusive about who he was and that he was not Canadian. And in fact, although we were able to start with his statement, his own statement in one of the files of the museum, that although he was not born in Barbados, he considered himself Barbadian. For his mother was a Barbadian, although his father was a Scot. He was born in Greenwich Village. And at the early age of 1 year, he was brought to Barbados, where he learned his ABCs on Hastings Rock. Now, Mcleod revealed the importance of his military record. Without the military record, we had no separate or independent confirmation of where he was studying at Parsons School. That was critically important revelation, and a date which would have placed him at that time. But what we learned is that, and I'll read a little bit more, a few more notes before I conclude. MacLeod, it's somewhat ironic that due to this circumstance of misidentification of Robert MacLeod as a Canadian, that occurred inadvertently through the work of one major art dealer and collector whose reference work, entitled Artists in California, has remained the authoritative research resource for decades. The late Eden Hughes, who on the eve of publishing his highly influential work, wrote about a similar situation for another pair of artists, one American and one Canadian, and he wrote this: In the annals of American art, there are many artists who share the same name. This has often led to confused biographical information and worse, incorrect attribution of artists' work. The case of the two W.W. Armstrongs is particularly fascinating, for even the existence of the second artist by that name had eluded art historians, leading to one long being identified as a competent painter of Great Lakes and erroneously California landscapes. This is the same situation with McLeod a century later. Later in the same article, outlining the meticulous process of untangling the differing careers of the two artists, Hughes opined that many 19th century landscapes of California held by leading national institutions have been inaccurately attributed to this Canadian artist and must rightfully be credited to another who had painted in obscurity and only now has been recognized as a California landscapist. He worked roughly contemporaneously with his better known Canadian counterpart. A check of all the biographical sources reveals no documented evidence that the Canadian painter ever traveled in California or that the Oakland painter ever left his adopted state. Same thing for Robert McLeod. This is ironically precisely the same situation in which Robert James McLeod's story has been placed as a result of the brief entry in Hughes' book, or supposedly that was the case. Specifically, issues related to confused biographical information and worse, incorrect attribution of artists' work, as well as even the existence of a second artist. Now, in my 4 years of research on this artist, I had located only 2 works which were identifiably by Canadian artists called Robert McLeod and signed Robert McLeod, but of similar vintage to our artists. But the paintings, when you looked at them, one is entitled Patience of 1971, could no way have been McLeod's. By then he was incapacitated or dead. So the signature on that painting of a McLeod was distinctly different and the wrong vintage. And the opportunity now arises that we can talk clearly about the landscapes and the legacy of Robert Jim McLeod, because this is the way in which we can finally recover his heritage and his identity in the Caribbean landscape. So ladies and gentlemen, I end here. I want to take the opportunity on behalf of the Barbados Museum to thank our panelists today.
Just a minute, we actually have 2, there's a question in the chat.
Oh, wow.
Let's hear someone who had their hand up first, so why I will go ahead and allow them to talk.
Okay, right. Well, what is the question, and we can put it to whomever.
Okay, so it's all 3 speakers contributed tremendously to our understanding of specificity of place and time. How important will this be to be considering 20th century painting in the region?
Well, we can speak from different standpoints, historically, artistically, and institutionally. Anyone like to have a go in answering that question? What did this experience mean for you?
I could probably respond in the sense that because I found it a little bit of a coincidence, in inverted commas, in a way, that an artist who's chosen to return to the Caribbean after a period abroad could be so specific about what he wants to paint and be committed to it, renting expensive studios in plantation houses in Dominica, and and going literally working on site as well. Because this idea that the images, landscape images, for example, sometimes people lose the sense that landscape images are created by artists who were in the landscape, and not just images of landscape culled from elsewhere. And that's why, again, I think abstraction takes it even further away from the sensation of experiencing the landscape. And I think in a kind of simple way, the artist is actually trying to allow the viewer to connect to the experience that he or she's having. So to take it into those areas, you lose the sensation of landscape. And that's why I think it's so important that's why I think the work is important, that it allows you to connect to these specific places in time and space, and shows the perspective that that person is interested in. Like I said, historically, visually, emotionally, very different things. And so it does enlarge the possibilities for landscape painting, if nothing else, when it's approached in that way.
Thank you very much, Winston. Very much appreciate your response. We did have a hand up from Art Atkinson. Is he here? Would he like to unmute and raise his point himself? Is he gone? I did see a hand up.
Yeah, I was up, and I did allow him to speak. He's joined as a panelist, but I'm not sure if he's still there.
Okay.
In the meantime, there is a question from Rodney Emmons, asking how we see any formal classical training, especially in the techniques of oil painting, or was he a student of any established artist?
Yeah. Very briefly, Rodney, just to say that indeed he did receive formal training. He was a student at the Art Students League and at the Parsons School. So he very much came under the influence of his tutors there. And then he himself indicated that he was, well, at those two instances, he would have been drawn into the art, the American Impressionist movement. And then in later life, he specifically spoke about the influence that he received from two American artists. He wrote that, McLeod wrote that he was most fortunate in later becoming the protege of one of America's outstanding landscape painters, Frank Bicknell. And at the home of this artist in Old Lyme, Connecticut, McLeod came into contact with many of America's first-rank painters. This is a quotation of a quotation. He also owes much to the well-known painter Bertha Metzler Peyton, the exquisite jewel-like coloring of whose landscapes has always inspired him in his work. So indeed, he was influenced both by his art tutors, but also contemporary artists or established artists who then he was much influenced by. And I see now that Atkinson, would you like to make your comment live? I think it's a very important point in terms of looking at the work. Okay, I read it. Just a comment. I have noticed over the years during this presentation a marked difference in sophistication between his work from life and that from his memory or imagination. Yes, I agree. One of the quotations that was made did recognize there was a maturing of his work as a result of his experience over time. So I do agree with you. It is noticeable, and his focus in terms of his work becomes more and more intense as he makes clear what is important for him in his production. Are there any other questions or comments? I see. Do we have a detailed provenance-like genealogy of his work around the world? Yes, one of the key things that we realized in doing this work, in finding the art, was that it was going to be important to have a sort of catalog resume. And indeed, our small committee that was thinking about this did bring up the point. So we had the catalog, in which we were determined to include as many pieces as we could. But the exhibition was only able to accommodate something like 45 pieces. The catalog resume that we have started at the museum includes about 92 pieces, and we are still adding pieces day by day as Barbadians and others realize what they have and let us know, so we're able to add that information to that database. So we are doing that. And yes, the families that supported his work in BIM. I did start, as I think I'm going to have to conclude, that the important point that I want to make, and I think I want to say how very important this comment was. Anthony Eduardo, he thanked the hosts and the panelists. He cannot thank them enough for their research and insight into the life of RGM. You have brought the artist to life for me. Thank you so much. Well, Anthony, I think you know that you and Simon and your connections with various people who owned work by MacLeod brought this artist to life. John and Rain Chandler, also thank you very, very much for loaning your work. Anthony, you were the one who made it possible for us to have a wide range of his genre in this exhibition through the absolutely wonderful collection you've assembled. Simon, your memories from your parents, your mother, collecting the work, and your recollection of who this artist was hugely important in giving us a sense of the person that we could talk about and we could appreciate. Others who were very, very staunch supporters of the artist were the Goddard family, the Fred Goddard and his wife Florence, and their children became staunch supporters of Robin McLeod. And without their support and their sponsorship, I don't think he would have really been able to live a decent life in Barbados. So thanks also to them. Thank you also to Mervyn Owen for loaning one magnificent piece. We really appreciate that he appreciated the artist and bought the work. And to Thomas and Kathleen Lawful, thank you so much for loaning us the 2 pieces. You made sure they got here on time and were included in the show. And we also want to thank the National Art Gallery, and Barbados Gallery of Art, whose collections also contained work that we were able to borrow. We have come to the end of our program, ladies and gentlemen, but I think it would be important for me, and I couldn't leave without, again, thanking our panelists, because they have done a magnificent job. I thank you, Winston, you, Lennox, and you, Mcleod, for making this contribution to the life, the legacy, and the landscapes of Robin McLeod. And I can't thank you enough for bringing this artist to life again. Thank you, everybody, for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you on another occasion when we work on the visual arts of Barbados. Thank you very much.
Did you know the artist Robert McLeod's Atlantic Rhapsody? Did you know that the prolific Bajan artist Robert James McLeod was often said to be Canadian, but he was born in New York of a Bajan mother and a Scottish father, a truly international heritage? The reason for the confusion is that there was another Robert McLeod who was Canadian and one who was American. Our Robert McLeod was born in Greenwich Village in New York, famous as the home of the hippies for decades. On August 24th, 1888, his mother was a Barbadian Yarwood, Ida Elizabeth, and she brought him home when he was just a year old. So apparently he always saw Barbados as home. He was at pains to tell people that he learnt his ABC on Hastings Rocks, and this dramatic schoolroom sight probably profoundly influenced him, creating a lifelong passion for painting the sea. He received his early education in Barbados, and he started drawing from the age of 7. He returned to New York as a young teenager and started to pursue art studies at what was called the Art Students League at 17 in April 1906. The Art Students League was an interesting network of studios, each run by an individual artist instructor. It was linked with a satellite facility, the Lyme Summer School of Art in Old Lyme, a small coastal village in Connecticut, a kind of art colony. This provided McLeod with experience and passion for plein air painting, that's out-of-doors landscape painting, that was to be his forte all his life. He did a bit of acting, he studied graphic art, he worked with the famous American artist Frank Bicknell in Connecticut, and he finally came home in 1936. Alessandra Cummins has produced a splendid book, a magnificent catalogue, but really a comprehensive retrospective collection of his work, telling the story of his close relationship with the Barbados Museum and drawing on the paintings owned by many collectors. These were loaned for the museum's exhibition, and it's a truly comprehensive show. The book is for sale in the museum shop. Alessandra describes his return at age 48 as the return of the prodigal. He lived in Barbados, in Hastings, then Chelsea Road, and then Culloden Road, and he visited Dominica, Grenada, and St. Lucia to paint there as well. So while he was passionate about his Barbadian seascapes, he was equally fond of the people and mountains of St. Lucia and Dominica. He also spent a couple of years at the museum as temporary curator. He was intimately involved with the philosophy and the approach of the Barbados Museum, and he held annual exhibitions of his paintings there every year or two for 20 years. Alessandra titled her book Atlantic Rhapsody. But while the subtitle, Elegy to the Islands, suggests a sad refrain, it's really a moving, almost surreal celebration of the sea, of the Atlantic surf, the beauty and energy. He seemed to be mesmerized by the ever-changing movement of the waves, although he could sometimes paint the tranquil sea at Martin's Bay with as much feeling as the magical movement at the Crane or Bathsheba. His strong, confident brushstrokes, his rich colors, and superb compositions produced the most moving rhapsodies. Sadly, Robert McLeod died in straitened circumstances, and he was interred at Westbury Cemetery on June 1st, 1971. His brilliant work is little known by Bajans today, 50 years later, and the museum has done a wonderful job in bringing him to light again. The fortunate folks who own some of his paintings have been kind and generous in loaning them. Robert Jim McLeod, the Robert McLeod, the Bajan, not the Canadian, not the American Robert McLeod, but a shining light turned on again by the Barbados Museum.